Welcome back to The Fix. If you've just joined us, we are looking at what the newly minted Finance Minister Tito Mboweni is likely to focus on in his medium-term budget policy statement, which he delivers this coming Wednesday on the 24th. With me in the studio, of course, is my panel, Dr. Azar Jamin, Hilary Joffe, Mr. Zwelinzima Vavi, and, of course, just joined now by Mr. Bonang Mohali. Good evening. I understand that you've had a very busy Sunday, but just quickly, we've discussed the fact that Mr. Mboweni isn't necessarily going to be able to do much with the numbers, but the tone that he's going to set is going to be very, very important. What are your expectations as business leadership South Africa?
Karima, thank you for having us. So first of all, we should not underestimate the effect that a leader can have on the performance of an organization. That's normally about 30 to 50%. So that's number one. Number two, as a country, as a people with great natural endowments, this is not the time to be married to ideology. This is not the time for business to be demanding growth for its own sake. This is not the time for labor to be demanding high wages, even though they are unaffordable. This is not the time for political parties to pay allegiance to their parties, but to really act in the best interest of South Africa, Inc. So when you ask the question, how is the government bloated? Let me give you an example. I mean, Nelson Mandela's cabinet was 20, Thabo Mbeki was 23. This current one is 37. Most state-owned enterprises are at least a third, far too many people. I've used the example of Eskom, 48,000 employees, 15,000 too much. In fact, their EXCO used to be 20, now it's 80 people. That's why the debt is really untenable.
You make a very good point, which of course brings me back to you, Mr. Vavi. I was speaking with Dave Lewis from Corruption Watch recently, and he said when he was originally part of crafting the Labour Relations Act and the labour laws, the ideas were not the protections that were being built in, wasn't to protect fat cats in the system from being dismissed. And of course we see your Siyabonga Gamas, your Tom Moyanis, and a lot of directors general and above, for example, going through these long labour processes and of course being protected, suspended with pay, and they're hiding behind the labour laws. Is that consistent with the ethos of worker rights? Are those the kinds of people that workers should be and trade unions should be protecting?
Well, that's not our priority, frankly. It is not our priority to defend 60, 70 cabinet and deputy ministers. We too agree that they must be cut back to where the numbers were in terms of the size of the executive. And that is going to hopefully only affect the high flyers, the DGs, the DDGs, and all of that. The story that we should talk about is the fact that, as you are correctly pointing out, there are 62,000 vacancies for police in the country. And that's why we have these high levels of murder, of everything that is going on at the crime level. We have 147,000 vacancies in the public service. Despite all of the nice music, that's our reality. And it means poor service, not only in the police stations, as we've demonstrated with the numbers, but in each and every school, in the public service, in the clinic, in the local government, that have been seeing lesser and lesser transfers from the national government because of our preoccupation with making my guy on the left happy and the rating agencies very, very happy. That's the state of affairs. So when we listen to the minister on Thursday, that's going to be our preoccupation. Will what he says make a difference to the numbers of unemployment, poverty, and inequalities, or will it just add to the current problems where the rich is getting more rich and the poor is getting more poorer? That's the story of the budget that we must look at.
I want to bring in the question of capacity. We all agree that there's very little capacity, particularly at municipal levels. And in the end, businesses do business with municipalities. They have to go through for their legislation, for all the kind of red tape and so on. We've seen the terrible state municipalities are in, and the answer's always been bring the right people in with the right skills, they will fix it. We've brought the KPMGs and those people in of the world, and of course they've aided and abetted state capture. So the answers aren't as obvious as we always think. What is the out-of-the-box thinking that is required to get capacity at local and municipal level, to make use of all the resources in our society, and to push back on corruption?
I'm sorry to be quite open about it, but there are a huge number of skills that have been sidelined on the basis of BEE in a lot of the municipalities and some of the public sector bodies. And if there were a lot of experienced people who could be extremely helpful and who are dying to be helpful and contribute towards the upliftment of society. You don't want to have a situation where 156 out of 244 municipalities spent less than 80% of their capital budgets last year. Was that through corruption? It wasn't only through corruption. It was because many of the people are just not competent enough to actually undertake the projects that are required.
Bonang, let me bring you in here. The question of deracializing the economy is an important one. Black business has a role to play. For example, when KPMG was affected, there was the big worry about what's going to be happening to black auditors. But to what extent must black professional bodies also take responsibility for turning a blind eye to getting rich quickly, to getting that tender quickly, to wanting to emulate old white apartheid morality? And because the whites ate, now it's our turn to eat. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, there is no moral equivalence. We don't want that framework to even begin to guide us. We want a more inclusive South Africa, a more just South Africa. There's very little from the apartheid years that we can learn about that. Why would we want to use that as our reference point as black business people?
Karima, you're absolutely correct. But I think let's puncture some inflated fallacies. So the first, you see, the easiest excuse is to say white people are not being employed because of BE. The facts tell us something differently. This regime has just killed more black executives than the whole of apartheid put together. And I'm just counting the 48 years, not the 350 years. This past regime has just killed more black small and medium enterprises than the whole of apartheid put together. The problem we are confronted with now, the 19th of December 2017, when we had a new president of the ANC, and in February, the new state president, is that he inherited a public administration that is worse than what we actually inherited from apartheid. So when you look at just the pure figures, white graduates, unemployment is 4%. Black graduates' unemployment is still north of 16%. The problem, when you listen to Dr. Zweli Mkhize, he says the budget for the cooperative governance and traditional affairs ministry in 5 years is 85 billion. Of that 65 billion in 5 years. Of that 8.7 billion gets sent back to Treasury because of lack of capacity to spend it. Of that 3.2 billion, it's recurrent unused expenditure, therefore they lose it. Maluti Apofung, Harry Smith, and the VAL. Here you see the effect of state capture, where we've been siphoning off about 100 billion South African rands a year every year on state capture. And state capture, like bribery and corruption, knows no color. Yes. This is not the time for white skilled people to be looking at labor and say, you are the enemy. The enemy is corruption.
Mr. Vavi, the issue around the role of trade unions, when you were still General Secretary of COSATU, I remember asking you this question, and it remained relevant. Health services, all the frontline services, police and all of that, is there not a special arrangement that these organizations must have with the state, given the fact that they are part of providing those services and that they don't just see themselves as trade unions without a political role? This is a developing country. It's a deeply unequal society. Most of the bedding that is being stolen at the hospital are being stolen by workers. Most of the corruption that's going on in prison happens with the say-so of prison unions, for example. What is it that worker organizations need to change in their ethics to also bring their bit and do things differently?
Two things, Karima, just in response to that question. In my view, first thing that we must do is to fix political leadership in the country. the state, and that's where I agree with you, the state have become more inefficient, more cumbersome, and it is producing less and less result for the people of this country on the basis that it is just unable to even carry out any of its basic programs, from ASGISA to an inclusive economy.
To rolling out Panado.
To even Panado or antiretrovirals in hospital. Our state has become so inefficient. And I don't want to, like them, blame the whole problem. Yes, the past 10 years of under Zuma presidency have been a disaster for South Africa. But please, let's not exaggerate that in order to hide a long-term program that we inherited from apartheid and which we continue to do very little about post-1994. That's my first point. The second point is that, yes, there is a need for a whole change of the mindset across the board, not only in the public service, but across the board. And this is what I normally joke about. We are the children of the defiers. We defied apartheid, we defied authority to the point that any authority, we feel that we are obliged to defy it. One thing we missed in 1994 is to inculcate a new ethos that will say to South Africans as a whole, we are now building a new country. You know why we couldn't do that? It was because in the main, the economy remained in the hands of a small white minority. So every time you could go to workers and say, let's change things, they will say to whose benefit.
All right, Mr. Vavi, we've run out of time. I would have loved to give you more time, of course. All eyes will be on the newly minted Finance Minister Tito Mboweni when he does deliver that important speech. Thank you so very much for joining us, Dr. Azar Jamin, Hilary Joffe, Mr. Zwelinzima Vavi, and Mr. Bonang Mohali. Thank you so much. Still ahead on The Fix, we speak to Vusi Mavimbela, a former spy boss who served both former presidents Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma, about his memoir, which hits the shelves on Thursday.